네, 여러분 안녕하십니까?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to PyeongChang Peace Forum 2022.
진행을 맡은
I am Kim Min-hee and I will be your MC for Special Agenda Session 1. It's very cold outside today, but despite the cold weather, thank you very much for coming to join us. And also to our online participants, my sincere gratitude to you all for your participation today.
2024년 강원 동계
In 2024, the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics will be held here in the province, and the special agenda session will be truly a special session that will deal with the Gangwon 2024 Winter Youth Olympic Games and inter-Korean peace promotion measures.
인사이트 얻어가시기를
I hope that you can find today's session useful. And let me now introduce you to our moderator. We have Professor Sangchul of Kyonggi University Graduate School of Politics. He will be assisting us with the discussions.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Yes, hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Park Sang-chul. I'm a professor at Kyonggi University.
그래서 내일 모레까지 진행.
The PyeongChang Peace Forum has begun today, and it's going to end for the next, go on for the next 2 days. I believe all of the sessions are, of course, important, but this particular session would involve a lot of food for thought, and it would invite much discussions, and that's why,
좋은 결론이 나오겠다고 생각.
as the moderator, I believe that we can draw important conclusions from this session. So, hopefully,
그런 시간 갖도록 하겠습니다.
we will have active discussions, and if time allows, we'll also entertain questions from the floor. The theme of this session is the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics and measures to promote peace, the two Koreas. Yesterday, the Beijing Winter Olympics came to a close, and in 2024, we're also going to see the Winter Youth Olympics being hosted here in PyeongChang and Wonsan.
남강원, 북강원 이렇게 해서 공동으로 개최가 될 가능성이 매우.
Hopefully, there is the possibility that we could have a joint hosting of the two Koreas. And in fact, it was with that in mind that we have named the Winter Youth Olympics the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. Oh, this location, which will host the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, will be a way for us to raise the Olympic spirit high, because it's the last remaining divided country on Earth. So if we can have a joint hosting of the Winter Youth Olympics, that would be very meaningful. And I understand the IOC is also very much interested in the outcome of the Olympics. I know that today we have many people with us today. The 3 speakers are going to be discussing their thoughts, and we also have 1 discussant. I'm going to introduce them all in turn. I'd like to ask you for your warm applause. Our first presenter is Resident Representative Bernhard Zeiger of the Hans Seidel Foundation here in Korea.
그리고 오늘 행사 전체
And
적인 그
I would like to say that our next speaker is Chairman Kim Kyungsung of the South and North Korea Sports Exchange Association. He has been a very pivotal and instrumental person in this session. Our next speaker is going to present by video. This is Magmed Maldive, who is the chairperson of the Gold Mongoose Foundation.
이분이 우크라이나에 있다 보니까
He's very well known, but he's based in Ukraine, and so because of the COVID-19 quarantine regulations, and right now the fact that Ukraine is going through something of a huge geopolitical challenge made it very difficult for him to attend. So we're going to give him an applause now, but we will see him by video.
한 분을 모셨습니다.
We also have a discussant who will be joining the panel later on.
아주 해박한 분이
And I would say that this person has a lot of knowledge regarding the current political situation in Ukraine, as he was the former ambassador to Ukraine for the Republic of Korea. Today, we would like to talk about the Winter Youth Olympics, peace in the two Koreas, but because Ukraine is also a very important matter here, I think that we have a very excellent person joining us, former Ambassador E Yangu.
제일 먼저
We'd now like to hear first from our first panelist,
하라트 제리
Representative Bernhard SELIGER of the Hans Seidel Foundation. Please give him a big round of applause.
Okay, hello everybody, and I hope, presentation is there, perfect. Now, you will ask yourself, what does that big man tell me about sports? I have to admit, I'm not a sportsman, but I hope I can tell you something about sports and civilian exchange in Germany in the time of division and how it relates to Korea. With the background that I worked since 20 years now also with North Koreans and North Korea, and though I would not like to call myself an expert, because nobody is an expert of North Korea, it's so difficult to get into their mind, but we have some maybe interesting experience there. You know this picture, this is in Gangwon, and 4 years ago, and there was this wonderful picture with the South Korean and North Korean flags together in the Olympic Village. And you know all these pictures, but admittedly, all of what was done there is gone. It's a pipe dream. It didn't happen. Isn't that sad for you? I don't know. I guess there's so many young people here. Some of you will be part in the Youth Winter Olympics in 2024, I hope at least. How do you want to organize it and hope that the North Koreans come when they simply refuse to come since April 2019? No more meetings, expressed commands by the leader not to talk to the South Koreans. It's so difficult. It's a pipe dream. On the other hand, I want to stress here, sports is probably one of the most important avenues for dealing with North Korea. Not because they like you so much or they like South Gangwon-do so much, though that would be nice, but because they like the recognition coming with sports. That's for them really important. So sports is a very good way to interact, but how can we do it? And let me look back at the German case. And even for the beginning, I want to look a little bit back at sports as a political tool. And that's, for me, I think, very important. Yesterday, Thomas Bach said again, sports is not about politics, it's about overcoming borders and meeting together. It's a lie. It's maybe a white lie, but it's not true. It was never about that. Sports was always extremely political. And it was political for the whole Greek states. They fought about Olympics. Some said Olympics is a sacred truth, so people don't fight each other, they just compete peacefully. At the same time, others tried to conquer Olympia to have it in their territory. And in the classic Olympic Games, there's this wonderful instance of Nero, the emperor of Rome, who went to Olympia, and he became, I think, in the running of the chariots, he became the first place because nobody dared to win over him. And a year or two later, when he was killed, his memory was erased from Olympia. And all of you know certainly very well the case of my country, Germany, which had this absolutely spectacular but shameful spectacle of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which was the most political. And for the Koreans especially, you will immediately think of the marathon, which was also political because the Korean runner was registered as Japanese. So it is about politics, and we have to admit this. And the same was the truth in Germany. In 1962, in the divided Germany, the Free German Youth got the explicit command by the Communist Party to show the superiority over West Germany in the Olympics as a sports political goal. And from 1952 on, there was this famous peace race of bicyclists going from Warsaw through then East Germany to Prague. And it was also extremely political. They invited Western bicyclists, but they used them for their propaganda. We shouldn't forget that. It's all about politics. And that's, I think, very important. And if you look back at Germany, we can say that already from the early 1950s, just when East Germany was founded, the German Sports Association was assigned this so-called West work, that is the kind of subversion to lure sports people to come to East Germany, etc. While in the same year, the National Olympic Committee of the West said, sports is politically neutral, everybody should participate. And that reminds me very much of Korea, because that's what you say, fortunately, because you are on the, I would say, right side there, on the peace side. You say it's neutral, it's not about politics, but that, unfortunately, is not the reality. And so sports was in Germany, like in Korea, always a contested place. However, we had the basic treaty between East and West Germany, and as part of that, and that was tremendously important, we had a regular discussion of sports representatives, and we had what we called a German sports calendar. So in the beginning of the year, or in the year before, the both countries came together and drew up a plan in what disciplines and in what competitions they would compete. And you see here, probably you don't see it, but you should see here, there's on the left hand the sports calendar for a few years of the 1970s. Let's say in 1977, there were 68 sports events scheduled, 40 were international, so international events maybe in West or East Germany where both sides participated, and 28 were really bilateral. Wasn't it wonderful? However, in that time, very often these plans were not fulfilled, but rather East Germany bowed out. For that or this reason, like with North Korea, it's very, very difficult. It's politics. And you see here our participation in Olympia, and we had a joint Olympic committee relatively long, or a joint team until 1964, and then we had for 20 years divided teams. And then from 1992 Olympics, fortunately, thanks to history, thanks to Helmut Kohl, thanks to George Bush and others, we could compete together again. And then suddenly we had the end of East German sports. The East German Sports Association was incorporated in the Western one. And then another very sordid chapter began, which I think one day might also reach North Korea, namely that of criminal prosecution of doping. We had in East Germany among the most doping cases, unfortunately. And I like this table. I don't know if you can see it, but for the 1970s, from 1973 to 1977, the world best swimmer, according to Swimming World, a leading paper, was always the East German. But when they, and in 1980 again, but when they found out they were all doped, so later it was all taken away the honor from them. And others, usually Americans, got then into the first place because they were not doped. So it's very, very difficult, sports competition. Now, the fundamental problem I see with sports competition, as South Korea does it now, like every other cooperation between North and South, it's so damped, sorry for the word, highly political, so high profile. Every sports event is an event where a minister comes, a province governor comes, where the whole media army of Korea comes, and South Korea, and it's never a simple, beautiful game. Invariable. With that, it depends on the political mood and can never create an independent sphere of cooperation where you say, we are just people doing soccer, we are just people skiing together. It cannot happen because it's all politics. And that means sports competition does not really pave the way for political cooperation, though we might think so. That's a narrative of the PyeongChang Olympics to say, first there was sports, then there was politics. But the reality was the other way around. Only because North Korea decided they needed politics, they allowed sports competition. I think that's very important because that shows us the realm we have of sports competition. And there's nothing wrong with this, but it makes sports competition useless as a way to foster cooperation. So the way with high-ranking, highly politicized sports meetings, we will not come from that to trust building, to foster cooperation. It's a thesis everybody of you should be against me now, I hope, because you are working for that, and you are rightly working for that, but I want to provoke you a little bit here. Now I want to tell you something else. I don't know who of you has been at this event. That was a sports competition, unfortunately, 2014, Kyonggi-do in Yeoncheon. It was a sports competition of you were there, you know it. Chinese teams, Chinese North Korean team, let's say, North Koreans who trained in China, and South Korean teams. It was beautiful. It was not too political. There was a lot of politics involved, like having the flag of North Korea being run in Yeoncheon there. That was political 2014, but it was not too much. And it was also not too much in the media. And it was brokered by kind of private intermediaries. And I guess you had a hand in there. It was very, very good, I think. I would call that people-to-people sports. It was not an official tournament. It was not a big media event, but it was something that worked. And I think that would be a way we should try to go to. And now that's a little bit sad, because I really would hope that we have the Pukkangwon, Namkangwon Winter Youth Olympics. It would be wonderful. And I love, by the way, North Gangwon province. I've often been there. We had projects there. It's a beautiful area, and certainly people are very similar to the people of South Gangwon. But it's so difficult to happen, because that's already a very high-profile event. Maybe it could work to create smaller events first. I mean, now Corona makes another difficulty, unfortunately, the non-travel conditions, but that might soon be over in 1 or 2 years. And that then really you try first to foster much, much less publicized meetings, probably in China or in another third state, where you compete against each other in a friendly way. I think that's really very, very important to understand. And I want also to point back to Germany, because in Germany it was the same. We were not cleverer than you, but we had one thing which was really different, that we had private cooperation, civilian exchange between West and East Germans throughout the time of division. And myself, I grew up fortunately in West Germany, almost in the Netherlands. But my relatives lived in Saxony, near Dresden and Chemnitz, or Karl-Marx-Stadt at that time. And I could visit them every year. I was small. But my parents came with me, and we sent a package to them every, I don't know, 3-4 months, coffee, for the ladies, some underwear or something, whatever they couldn't buy in East Germany. It was beautiful. It was not political. No Secret Service of West Germany ever looked into these packages. The East Germans tried to steal something, but we took it as granted. And there was an exchange going on. And that exchange in Germany, it was 3 times bigger, the civilian exchange, than public funding. So that's also a point. Here, everything has to run. Sorry, I don't want to be critical, but because we work with Tonglbu, and they're really important partners, but everything runs through Tonglbu. And if you want to visit North Korea, one of my staff is here. She did that once. The Chagwan or Changwan, the vice minister or minister, has to decide if that's possible, that an ordinary South Korean, very harmless person goes and looks at a tree nursery in North Korea. And that's, I think, not right. To expand the realm of private exchanges. And that, in the first place, also includes sports. Because the North Koreans are eager sportsmen, they're good sportsmen, and they like this recognition. But they don't like the limelight. They don't like to be here, and 100 photographers and streamers and everything are there. That is very difficult for them, because that creates trouble at home. So a much more quiet approach to sports diplomacy might work. I don't say it works. As I said, I don't feel really to understand the North Koreans. And they are clearly, we saw that now with the Beijing Olympics, it was for them a place to compete. And certainly they were disappointed they did not compete. But other goals, fighting Corona, political stability, were more important for them. So we have to accept it also that it can fail. But if it can work, I personally think it can only work if you put it firmly in the place of civilian exchanges. And now my last words are, I say them for every presentation I do, For that, you also have to change your national security law. I'm not a communist and I'm not a lefty, but you have to modernize your national security law to create this realm of civil exchanges. So, conclusion, we need this radically new approach, and the national security law is there. And we need to accept that the Korean government cannot control everything anymore in these sports exchanges. It's the exchange of free people doing sports. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Yes, thank you very much for that presentation. Can see that you've mentioned that you're not an expert in North Korea or sports, but I can see that just listening to your presentation, you truly understand this divided situation of the two Koreas because you have the experience in Germany. I can see that this was such a candid talk, especially when it comes to a divided state. And you've mentioned that Thomas Bach, every time he mentions that Olympics is neutral from politics, and you've mentioned that this is a lie, that it is truly political. So I think that you've actually hit the nail there. It's true. And if you look at the two Koreas, it's great if we can find a way to unravel this politically, but we're at a stalemate. So we're trying to find a way for sports to play a role. But I think that we also have the Vice Minister of Unification here today. But what was really important that he's mentioned was that there was a lot of civilian cooperation and education between the two Germanies. So there was a lot of channels. But if you look at Korea, both North and South, we're at a stalemate and impasse between the two, politically speaking. So civilian cooperation is key, but you can see that the circumstances does not allow that. So the essence here is that, well, at least maybe sports can play a certain role in that regard, but maybe with a different approach. So thank you so much for that presentation. A big round of applause once more for our speaker, please. And let us now move on.
그동안에 이 자료에도 나와 있습니다.
Our next presentation
남북 간에 22차례의 스포츠 교류와
is going to be on 22 different kinds of sports exchange that have been held over the last 15 years. And it was really thanks to most of these sports exchange programs that we were able to have a glimmer of hope between the two Koreas. And we would like to invite Mr. Kim Kyung-sun as the chairman of the South and North Korea Sports Exchange Association.
안녕하십니까? 저는
Ladies and gentlemen,
오늘 발표할 발제 내용이
today I would like to give a presentation on
경험
it's based on my own experiences on sports exchange between the two Koreas over the past 20 years. And based on my experiences, I would like to talk about what I perceive to be sustainable sports exchange between the two Koreas. Just now we've heard from Dr. SELIGER that sports is politics, and I cannot deny that either. Today, we heard the New York Philharmonic, the quartet, give a presentation or a performance rather at the opening ceremony
동평양 대극장에서
in 2008.
뉴욕 필하모닉 미국 공
I remember the New York Philharmonic also gave a performance in Pyongyang and the DPRK. In fact, I believe they played the national anthem of the DPRK.
올라갑니다.
And the American flag
이것이 문화
flew high over Pyongyang at the time. This was possible because it was a cultural performance. Governor Choi Moon-soon of Gangwon province say that culture cannot be seen to be political, but culture is the most sophisticated means. It's the most sophisticated political tool. And I think that sports is also a very important political tool, that it can go into places where politics cannot. And I think that it's a very peaceful means to that end. So I think that sports really is a way for us to ease conflict. It's a tool for peace, and I'm going to elaborate on why I think that is based on my performance, based on my experiences. The Beijing Olympics recently ended,
동계 청소년
and based on that,
올림픽 개최
I was able to think about the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. We will be hosting the games then, and I also had the opportunity to meet with some of my counterparts in Beijing
IOC
during the Winter Olympics as a spokesperson and a representative for Choi Moon-soon.
지난 개최
And at the time, I met with 206 different members of delegations of different countries of the IOC,
강원 청소년
and We discussed the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, the Summer Olympics, Paris and Milan, all of the Winter Olympics hosts. It was a gathering of Olympic family members, in fact. In fact, there is a place there called the Olympic Club. And if you step into the Olympic Club, this area is restricted by the IOC. Politicians are not allowed entry. It's only for the Olympic family members. So IOC or NOC committee members or Olympic family members. So this means the past host nation or the future host country.
스포츠 외교가
There, we can engage in sports diplomacy.
피파의 회장은 체어맨을
The FIFA is headed by somebody called the chairman, but the IOC is headed by a president. The president and a chairman are different names. They want to try to create an area of peace and cultural and sports exchange that is devoid of politics. In the past, Olympics was very political. Even now, I think there are many aspects of the IOC and the Olympic Games that are political, but the Olympic really tries to at least strive to stay away, as much away from politics as possible. And now I'd like to talk about my own personal experiences. I mentioned that I went to the Beijing Games this time around. There are two goals to my visit. The first was to ask for support for the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics.
2024 올림픽
And to that end, I had two weapons at my disposal, the fact that we are a host nation and that we wanted to engage in more support projects for the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. And I brought a letter from Governor Choi to Thomas Bach to try to ask for more support.
강원도에서 1,000만 달러
We have $10 million from the ROK government, $10 million from the Gangwon provincial governments. We had this budget
청소년들을 불러서 남강원
to try to engage in more support projects, to provide training facilities and training fees for impoverished nations. And when we gave this letter to Thomas Bach, he was very thankful.
올림픽을 치른 것이 첫 치른 것이
Thomas Bach, after he became president, the first Olympic Games that he presided over was the PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games. And at that time, the two Koreas met and we saw a glimmer of hope for peace. Thomas Bach said that he felt a huge hope and huge encouragement. However, the Beijing Olympics, because of COVID, was much more diminished in scale because of the pandemic.
강원도에서 한다니까
The
너무
2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics
토마스 바우 위원장
is something that Thomas Bach is really looking forward to because he says that Gangwon-do as a province, it is a symbol. And he said that the 200 or so members of the IOC will work together for the support of the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics.
한다고 해서
I also met with Mr. Jeremy, and he also said that he wants to lend his full support to the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. And Mustafa Barafu, the Africa IOC head,
눈이 없는 나라를 초청해서 동계 스포츠를 지원하겠다는
said that he is very touched by the efforts of Gangwon Province because, as I mentioned before, we have sent in a letter pledging our support to helping impoverished nations, particularly those nations where they don't have natural snow. So
평창 동계올림픽의 평화 유산과 함께
we wanted to say that we want to build upon the legacy of the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympics to try to have a successful 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. And when I went to Beijing, I told them about the support project that Gangwon has in mind and also our plans to hopefully have a joint hosting of the two Koreas.
남북이라는 것은
The different IOC member countries have pledged their support to this.
스포츠 외교를 통해서
This is sports diplomacy in action, and hopefully through this we can lessen the burden for DPRK to participate as a co-host and a joint host of the Winter Youth Olympic Games.
정치적 갈등에서 속에
There were, over the past 20 years, much political turmoil between the two Koreas, but we still engage in sports exchange, and we were able to have a bridge of hope and peace despite the crisis. And just briefly, I want to go over those some events to try to talk about hope for the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics.
한반도는
The Korean Peninsula
진정한 주인으로서 정부가 진정
is a place where the two Koreas should have ownership, but we in fact don't have that ownership because there are those issues such as denuclearization and economic sanctions. And these are issues where the two Koreas themselves cannot resolve. There are these many global geopolitical tensions that exist in the Korean Peninsula. We're in the eye of the storm. And when there is no dialogue between the two Koreas, what can we do? Civilian organizations and private sector cooperation and sports exchange can help us overcome this divide. If we take that globally, that could be Olympic Games or other such bigger games. And despite these kinds of military tension and all of the different kinds of conflict and struggle over the past years, at least we have that final frontier, the final bridge between the two Koreas, which is sports exchange.
올림픽은 유엔 대북 제재를 극복할 수 있는 유일인 방안.
The Olympics is really the only way for us to overcome the UN North Korea sanctions. 2 years ago, the DPRK
리조트 개발
already designated the Wonsan area as a resort complex, and the Baekdusan resort complex was also completed. They invested heavily into this, but they cannot make use of these complexes because of the sanctions and because of COVID-19. Who can come in and rescue these different plans? I believe that the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, if it can be joint hosted by the two Koreas, can solve this problem. So I think that this is something that the DPRK will be grateful for, because right now the political situation is very difficult. The local governments can host Olympic Games and engage in support projects. Bring in host and member nations of the UN, many African countries who would be beneficiaries to our support.
젤리커 박사님께서 아까 사진을 보여.
Early on, we heard Dr. SELIGER and show us a lot of his photographs in his presentation.
부분 중에 하나입니다.
Many of them were also instances where we engaged in sports exchange to overcome political hurdles. In 2008, in July, as you know, there was a tourist in Kumgangsan Mountain who was killed, and because of this, the tours were suspended.
그러나 바로 우리
However,
남북협회와 북한의 사회체육까지
our association,
들쑥날쑥한 대북 정책 속으로
despite the difficulties and the challenges of 2008,
정착했던 바로 남북 유소
we have continued to have the
정상적으로
inter-Korean youth soccer exchange
금강산이 중단
in that same year, which we have continued to do for 22 consecutive years. So as you can see, the DPRK allowed this sports exchange, this youth soccer event to happen. And the Conservative Party here at the ROK also allowed this to happen. So this means that although there's chaos and tension between the two Koreas, we both want at least one channel open for us to engage in cooperation. And this is through sports, and namely through youth sports.
2010년도에
In 2010, there was the Cheonan incident, and because of this, the May 24 measures were announced by the Lee Myung-bak administration, bringing a suspension of inter-Korean exchange.
북한과의 약속을 이어나갔죠. 어디서?
However, we continued to fulfill a promise to DPRK in a third country. By that I mean China. In China,
극단적으로 대립을
because there was so much tension between the two Koreas,
남북 스포츠 기라
and because the government had suspended all activity between the two Koreas, we were able to host some of these activities in a third nation, in China. This shows us that when we engage in sports exchange, it does not necessarily have to be in South or North Korea. Sometimes we host this in China. Let's say if there's a war situation in Ukraine, if there is a lot of conflicts in Ukraine, that does not mean that Ukraine and Russia cannot have collaboration. Perhaps they can continue to have collaboration, maybe through sports exchange, on some other third nation. I think that if they try to do that, Russia and Ukraine would not say no. And I think that the neighboring countries would be willing to host that kind of exchange events. So as you can see here, there are many instances where sports has been used as a way to maintain some level of peace, even in the most extreme of circumstances.
이 내용에서 마지막으로 우리 동계
In my presentation file, I want to skip through
그왜 남북 공동
to talk about why the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics should be joint hosted by the two Koreas.
2019년도에
In 2009,
잘 알겠지만은
I'm sure you remember that there were some findings, research findings,
남북한의
that were announced. And it said that inter-Korean economic exchange, if it can last for about 30 years,
G7을 넘어서 G2까지
our economic size would go beyond the level of G7 countries.
말씀을 드렸죠.
That is how big our economies will grow.
지원 사업을 인정한다 그런 거예요.
As I mentioned before earlier, that the IOC is supportive of our support projects. And the support projects of Korea for the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics is to help the 50 or so African nations, those nations where there's no natural snow, to allow them for a week-long training session in Gangwon-do in South Korea and possibly even an additional week-long training session in North Korea. Some of these athletes would be able to cross by bus, by land. Some of them would be able to cross by river or by the plane. So we would have all of these different routes.
북강원도 원상항으로
Oh.
바닷길을 합니다. 이 여러 직
By river, by land, and by air. All of these different routes will be open for the athletes as part of a support project for the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. The IOC is supportive of this, and I believe the DPRK would also be supportive of this. Once we have these routes established, these channels established, later on after the Olympic Games have ended, we can maintain them and use them as tourist trails. As I mentioned before, DPRK have invested heavily in all of these different tourist resort complexes, but they don't have tourists. They don't have sufficient traffic and transport infrastructure. However, as you know, ROK has extensive transport infrastructure. You can get from Incheon Airport within 1 hour to Gangwon-do if you just hop on a KTX train. We have this extensive infrastructure, so I believe that tourists who would like to come to Korea and also see North Korea would be able to use this trail, all of these different routes that will be used by the athletes for the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics to go tour North Korea, go see Pyongyang. In just 30 minutes, we can go from Wonsan Airport to the Baekdusan area, have a day trip of Baekdusan Mountain. All of these different routes would be able to facilitate these kinds of tourist activities.
북한도 환영하고
This is a project and an initiative that the DPRK would welcome, and it's also an economically beneficial project for the two Koreas. And this would be something that would be made possible by sports diplomacy. Gangwon-do province has two weapons. The first is that we are a host of the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, and we also have these support initiatives in place. Yes, you can use a little bit more time. You don't have to rush too much. So, as I've been saying, the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics would be able to build on the legacy of the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympics.
사실 판문점 선언이라는
The 2018 Games led to the Panmunjom Declaration and the US DPRK summit. However, as we know, we have gone back to square one.
전기 통로로
At the time, we should have opened and recontinue the tourist trails in Kumgangsan and Mount Kumgang. If we had that civilian kind of passageway, then we might not have seen a standstill right now.
그
When the West Sea
상을 당했습니다. 전쟁입니다.
incident took place, there were about 30 people, 30 soldiers who lost their lives. It was almost a wartime situation, but it did not escalate to war because there were civilian exchange programs such as the tourist programs in place. I think that
대한민국의 관광
going forward, if we can have all of these different tourist
평화의 관광
and tours, these new trails and routes and channels that will be opened by the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, this would facilitate sustainable peace for the two Koreas. And this is what we can do for the private sector. Thank you.
시간을 좀 서치한 것은 시작하기 전에 그 북경
I have said that he can use a little bit more time in his presentation because he has presented early on talking about his time spent in the Beijing Olympics. I know that he had a long presentation file prepared, but we were not able to hear most of it because of the time shortage. So maybe if there are questions later on from the floor, he can give some more comments. I know that Mr. Lee is very passionate about sports exchange, and he's also someone who is recognized not just in Seoul, but also in Pyongyang.
나오신 말씀 중에서
In some of his comments, when he began his presentation, he said that there is this conflict
저는 스포츠보다는 정치에 좀 더 전문적이라고
within South Korea, but also between North Korea and South Korea.
참 우리가 아쉬운 게
I think that there are lots of different unfortunate incidents, such as the Kaesong Industrial Complex suspension and the suspension of the Mount Kumgangsan tours. These were quite unfortunate. If we look back on them now, perhaps we should have found some other alternative. Of course, this would depend on your different position. But I think that through sports, we might be able to restore some of these different events. And the fact that in 2024, we have the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympic Games that we can leverage is an encouraging bit of news for us. Hopefully by then, COVID-19 would have dissipated and perhaps we might have had more chance for dialogue with North Korea. And the IOC President Thomas Bach said that he himself would like to see a joint hosting of the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics. And that is why he said also that we can also think about naming the Olympic Games Gangwon Winter Youth Olympic Games. Because as you know, most of the Olympic Games are named after cities. But in our case, it's named after a province because there's that openness to have a joint hosting by the DPRK as well. And I hope that Mr. Kim Kyung-sung would work tirelessly in that regard. Please give him a big round of applause. Next, we'd like to move on to our third presentation.
마고메드
We have Magomed Maldive, president of the public organization Mongoose. He has sent us this video. But I would like to ask for your understanding because his audio and the video does not match, so that might be a little bit confusing. But still, I ask for your understanding. A big round of applause, please.
And equality are three axioms on a healthy planet. In the 21st century, millions of public and political figures, businessmen, world-renowned personalities in the fields of music, film, science, and religion have united to maintain international peace and security through peacemaking activities, as well as to create conditions conducive to the establishment and consolidation of peace. However, on a daily, regular, gradual and confident basis, using the tools of preventive diplomacy and cooperation, sports plays the leading role in preventing international conflicts. Sport is an ambassador for peace. The motto of the Golden Mongoose International Sports Award, calling for the resolution of intrastate and ethnic conflicts, is a metaphor for a global dialogue based on the assertion of justice and human rights, tolerance and a culture of peace. Peace is when a Ukrainian is among the first to congratulate the Russians on their gold medal at the 17th Summer Olympics in Tokyo. Peace is when athletes from South Korea and North Korea walk together in the parade of participating countries at the opening of the 18th Winter Olympic Games in PyeongChang. I can say with confidence that the 4th Winter Youth Olympic Games in Gangwon-do, South Korea, will retain its significance in 2024. It is sport preventive diplomacy that is meant to serve as the most effective tool of international dialogue, an opportunity to maintain peaceful coexistence and cohesion through sport. The hosting of competitions of global significance will certainly strengthen mutual trust between the two states of the Korean Peninsula. The Winter Youth Olympic Games will serve as a worldwide forum for the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to raise and discuss complex issues, including war and peace. Through face-to-face interactions between athletes, coaches, and government representatives, a dialogue will be established between them. This will enable the development of ways to resolve disputes peacefully. Remember, our common goal today is to walk the difficult path from conflict to peace, to protect future generations from the scourge of war, and most importantly, to affirm the faith of peoples in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in gender equality and equal rights for nations large and small through international cooperation in sport. The peacemaking power of sport is invisible, even when faced with threats of war and human rights violations.
끝났습니까?
Is that all?
박수로.
Yes, a big round of applause, please.
아마 들어오기다가 안 보시되니까 이제 충분한.
I believe that he was to come to take part, but he probably wasn't able to provide enough presentation materials for this conference. I do know that the Mongoose Award is basically like the Nobel Prize in sports, and I believe that Mr. Kim, it was in 2019 when you won that award, and I know that you received a lot of congratulations, so it was a great honor for Korea as well. So you mentioned about the importance of sports, so thank you very much for that. In terms of the proceedings from going forward, we do have panel discussions to follow. And as I've mentioned, we also be hearing from our panelists, former Ambassador E Yangu. So with regard to the presentations, I'm sure that he can also add another layer in addition to the case that we've heard from the case of Germany. And Dr. SELIGER and Chairman Kim Kyungsung, I think that you can also spare some time to add any more comments that you would like to deliver to the audience. So that's how I would like to proceed with the panel discussion. So first, let me now invite Ambassador E Yangu for his comments. A big round of applause, please.
네, 귀한 자리에 초청해 주셔서
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. I believe I was also here about a year ago at the PyeongChang Peace Forum.
있나 그걸 좀
Try to look back at the changes that have occurred over the past year.
준비했는데
I also have prepared some remarks, but instead of reading these prepared remarks, I think it would be better if I give a more of an impromptu discussion here. Recently, the Beijing Olympics were held.
이렇게 하는 게 영광이기도 하지만
It's always an honor to host such a big game, but it was also a huge burden as well. I was the ambassador to Ukraine, but the situation right now surrounding Ukraine, particularly the military tension, has already begun and it's seeing a little bit of an escalation. This is a huge geopolitical risk as well. And we also know that the COVID pandemic has been in place for the last 3 years.
후폭풍이 굉장히
And
많은데요.
I think that there will be more repercussions of COVID in the future.
전쟁은 더 심화되고 있고
There will be more competition between the US and Russia, and the DPRK has also launched another strategic missile very recently. So there are all of these different
그래서 많은 분들이
external situations that are not particularly conducive to peace right now.
책을 읽었더니
Recently, I read a book
바이러스
that says
완전히 다르다.
the situation before and after the pandemic were very different. The global order that was established after 1945 post-war has demolished, and we don't know what the future may bring yet. The future order has not been established yet. The current situation is kind of like a monster to us. So this is the kind of situation that we find ourselves in. Leading up to the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, we want to try to turn it into a big festival. And if we want to do so, we have to understand the current reality of the situation and try to be very professional in our preparation leading up to the games. That was the first comment that I wanted to say. The second comment is that the 2024 games could bring about peace and prosperity for the two Koreas. And to do so, I think it would be helpful if we can expand the region. There are many things that the two Koreas cannot do on our own, but cooperation continues to be very important. So we have to maintain a cooperation. In that sense, I hope that we can have more cooperation, not just on the Korean Peninsula, but somewhere else, involving us in Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, elsewhere, so that we can continue to tell more people about the importance of inter-Korean cooperation. And I do think that we should also expand the scope of the games, because we shouldn't just think about these elite sports, but also amateur sports. So not just a professional level sports, but amateur sports as well. And the sports industry is a green industry.
그린 라이프이기 때문에
And sports life is called a green life. And so we understand that sports is very important in our lives. Right now, around the world, we talk about SDGs and ESG and carbon neutrality and digital transformation. I think that sports is very relevant to all of these four different themes that are currently the keywords right now in the international community. In Russia, when we look at the situation unfolding there and some other countries, it brings us reasons for despair. But there are also some other countries that inspire hope and good values in us, such as the many countries that are pursuing SDGs and ESG and etc. Ultimately, it comes down to, when we look at SDGs and ESG, it means that we have to be responsible for actions. We have to be kind and nurturing so that we can have win-win. And I think that sports touches upon all of these different values, which is why we have to emphasize more participation into sports exchange. Because with sports, as you know, the sports athletes, they're always engaging in fair competition. They work very hard. They're accountable for their actions. And so I think that sports is really, its resonance with SDG and ESG and all of these different keywords. Last year, I have proposed that we should try to think about setting up a global leadership academy for sports, so that we can have more of this leadership academy could foster sound and healthy habits through sports. This is something that sports discipline can have a role in. Earlier on, Mr. Kim Kyung-sun, the chairman, said that sports diplomacy could be very impactful, and Korea has its own ODA assets. In the private sector level, we have continued to work on our cooperation, but the government also has its ODA assets. So in terms of public cooperation, perhaps the government can engage in sports diplomacy using ODA as a means. This could be a way for us to have more develop a sports industry for Korea. One of Korea's big advantages is that we have social sports infrastructure. We have the four major river trails, the Tulle Trail, the Olle Trail, all these different trails and infrastructure that we can make use of here in Korea. Whether it be through ODA or SDG funding, we can export this know-how to other countries. And this could be a way for us to have a growth engine for corporations, but also enhance our own international standing overseas. I'm sure you've heard of what is known as the Blue Zone. These are the four villages around the world, or the four areas around the world, where they see the longest longevity of the people. This Blue Zone is a project that I'm also involved in. So the Blue Zone, where towns and villages where people have really increased longevity. They have very much health and long lifespan, and they do so. One of their 9 principles is that they continue to move. They engage in sports and exercise. And you know that in Korea we have a lot of sports associations. If we love sports and we continue to exercise and work out, then our happiness index continues to go up. So this is something that we should pursue. And we can pursue this through different projects, encouraging people to ride their bikes more or walk and jog more, and have more fostering of sports associations or neighborhood associations. And this could be smart city and smart town. Earlier on, we saw the launching ceremony of the Global Inter-Gangwon Cooperation Network. If we can have a blue zone town, maybe Gosong could be a blue zone town, for instance, and I think that this could be impactful for our efforts towards sports. The 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, what can we do to try to turn it into a big festival, have peace and prosperity for the Korean Peninsula and for the world? Right now, it's 2022, so we have about 3 years left remaining. I think that we need to come up with a very detailed roadmap leading up to the Games. I have huge expectations for the Games because, first of all, the Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics is going to be held in 2024. The Rosanna Congress is also going to be held in 2024. It's a huge religious gathering, and this is also going to be held in Korea, which is why 2024 is going to be a very important year. Many religious faith believers would come to Korea at that time in 2024. And lastly, the UN Procurement Office and the Korea's SDG Council host an SDG forum every year, and they also host an exhibit. As you know, the DPRK is somewhat surprisingly very much open to the idea of SDGs, and the UN is also trying to facilitate more efforts with SDGs within the DPRK. So hopefully in 2024, because all of these different events are going to be held, that maybe we can have an Inter-Korean SDG Expo. We can organize like that in 2024. The SDG Expo could be very wide-ranging and include a lot of different issues and subjects. So I think that this could be a very important way for us to have sports be an anchor for peace and prosperity. And we can demonstrate this to all of us in 2024. And I hope that Gangwon and PyeongChang can play that role. Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다. 저도 보니까 1년 전에 우리 대사님하고 같이 여기서
Yes, thank you very much. I remember that it was a year back when we held an event together. And typically, 1 year, what would happen is you get older, but I can see that you have even more fresh, novel ideas. Maybe it's all because of COVID.
것 때문에
And because of COVID,
이후의 질서는
you can see that the order that was sustained since 1945 is obsolete, and you can see that the future is truly not something that we have anticipated. So it's in 2 years, in 2024, where the Winter Youth Olympics in Gangwon will take place, and I think that it carries substantial meaning.
아까 그 골든 몽구스
And of course, the president of Golden Mongoose actually sent a very short video, so we have a lot of time remaining for our panel discussion. We're supposed to close this session at 6:50,
저 사회 보는 사람 주어진 시간
and I know that there's a lot of time allotted for the moderator, so I think there's not much that I can share here. So I would like to ask our two speakers to actually add additional comments from 2 to 3 minutes, or so, if you do have any. And I know that we have many experts here today on this very topic joining us in the audience. And I would like to ask you to jot down a couple of questions and pose these questions, get your questions ready as while the two speakers add some more comments. And you may designate the guest to answer your question. So I would like to invite 2 or 3 questions, voluntary questions from the floor.
포럼 이 섹션
And I think that would make this session much more productive. So then,
거꾸로 할게요.
let me go in the reverse order. First, Chairman Kim Kyung-sun, would you like to spare 2 to 3 minutes to maybe share some more comments? It could be in response to Ambassador Lee's comments. Anything that you would like to add? Please proceed. So why don't we give him a big round of applause? I think there's no reason to save our applause. So please.
이제 오늘 개막식에 이제 참석하신 분들은
I
보셨을
think those of you who attended the opening ceremony would know you have seen the New York Philharmonic performance.
공연이 아니죠.
As you know, they are a world-renowned
공연이 바로
group, and the fact that they performed here is quite meaningful.
얻어진 신뢰를 바탕으로
They have built trust with the DPRK when they performed in North Korea, and I think that trust continues
전지 훈련을 내려왔어요.
to this day. In 2007, at the time,
인천공항에
in March or so, I believe the U.S. ROK combined military exercises were being held here. At the time, there was a month-long athletic practice session that was held there.
에는 남북체육
That was the first time I actually met Governor Choi Moon-soon. He was at NBC at the time. And there was a lot of support that we were able to have. And in China, in Kunming, we were able to host an academy of sorts to try to provide free sports exchange to North Korean youth. So it was a free kind of athletic summer camp or spring camp for DPRK youth athletes. And this kind of trust built up between the DPRK and NBC. And later on, this led to the performance of the New York Philharmonic. In fact, it was Governor Choi Moon-soon, who was the head of MBC at the time, who organized the performance of New Philharmonic.
간의 종전선언까지 역할을 하고 싶다.
At the time, he said that hopefully we can have an end-of-war declaration between the DPRK and the U.S. And as governor, he was able to host the PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games.
캐리 국무차관과
And in Kerry, Secretary, Assistant Secretary Kerry, and Kim Young-nam, and Kim Yo-jong later on sat in the PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games.
2024 올림픽은 바로
Choi Moon-soon wanted to have more of a bridge between the U.S. and DPRK. But after the 2018 PyeongChang Winter Olympic Games, much of those efforts were derailed. That is why he's trying to have a second attempt with the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, because we have this weapon that is currently at our disposal, this weapon of sports exchange.
베르나르드
Yes, Mr. Seliger, would you like to give us your comments?
Okay. Yeah, the first thing which came into my mind when Ambassador Lee talked about the roadmap towards the Winter Youth Olympics, it's very, very few time. And I wonder, did you ever consider to invite North Koreans to an online event, planning event or whatever on that? Because North Koreans, we can observe in the recent year, started to become relatively active for North Koreans in joining such events. And it would be really a good thing, not invited by the South Koreans because they wouldn't come, but to say the International Olympic Committee or some preparatory committee, which is a multilateral institution, could invite them to a meeting to get a first contact again. And then I would talk about the how, what, and where of competition. And the first thing is the where. Third countries, I think in the moment the only way to start cooperation again. North Koreans will not easily come to South Korea. That is true. And that was true in the last 10 years basically also, with this one short exception of 2018 to April 2019. And I really would consider go into third countries and don't go into developing countries. North Koreans, I hope they don't look here. They're snobbish. They like the big thing. They like America, they like Europe, they like Switzerland, they like big names. So invite them to another country. You need to spend some money, but you have this big inter-Korean cooperation fund. Since 20 years, you have $1 billion inside which you never ever spend. Use some of that money. It's your money and it cannot be better used. And then with whom? What I was a little surprised of, you never mentioned university sports. Because amateur sports is nice, but North Korea doesn't really have amateur sports on a large scale. I mean, they have school sports, they have university sports, army sports, but not really civilian sports. So think of universities, because, for example, Kim Il-sung University does have, I think, 20 or 30 nominal partners in the world. And you could go through this channel. And finally, the how, I think, and that's about these international restrictions. It is a problem with sanctions, but and sanctions exemptions won't help you, because that means you have a spotlight on an event, you have to mention everything beforehand. So go to the Americans before you go to the North Koreans and tell them to negotiate a damn deal where they say, okay, sports is sports, humanitarian is humanitarian, and economy is a different business. And if a little bit of money goes here and there, that's the course of the world. It was also in Germany. When we spent money on East Germany, also not all ended for purely humanitarian. And the Secret Service stole money and they took money for our motorways and put it into their army or whatever. But in the end, it were peanuts compared to the goal we wanted to have, cooperation. So we really should negotiate that.
네, 이게 이양구 대사님한테만.
Yes, thank you. I don't think that was a question just for Ambassador Lee, but I think that those ideas were very excellent. Engaging in online exchange with the DPRK. This is something that we could have. In fact, I understand that many defectors, North Korean refugees,
정말 좋은 아이디어가
have that kind of online connection with their homeland, and the fact that we can think about hosting in a third country,
다양하게
and thinking about not just who, but the how question. These are very important questions that you've raised. Ambassador Lee, would you like to respond?
예, 제가 또 동북아 공동체 문화재단 대표를 맡고 있는데요.
So,
저희 재단이
I'm also a part of an organization. It's a cultural organization where we support different organizations in Yanbian, and also we try to do some outreach to North Korea. And I was also a consul at Vladivostok. So I understand very well that the DPRK does not want to maybe sometimes interact with us directly, but they might be open to go through a third nation, Russia, of course, and also even places like Mongolia. So
의사를 양성하는 거라든지
the fact that when it comes to nurturing talent, educational and training programs, maybe training for doctors or physicians, DPRK is always open to that. And so with sports as well, if there is a way that we could do outreach to try to nurture their sports industry, for example, or have more sports professionals, this could be an enticing way to get the DPRK to cooperate with us, perhaps in a third country, such as Russia or Mongolia and elsewhere.
모 대학에서 이제
There is one university
동북 삼성으로
the northeast provinces of China
중국 이렇게 3개국 간의 어떤 그 대학을
that is thinking about trying to create a campus or a university that could serve students in the Republic of Korea, the DPRK, and China, and have a kind of a degree, a program for those three countries. And I think that that's also meaningful.
할 때는 그 처음에는
Yeah, so there were many comments, and typically when we do ask our audience to interact, we sometimes call on certain members of the audience, but we do have former Vice Minister Kim Young-sup here today, so a big round of applause. Would you like to share with us some of your comments, please?
반갑습니다. 저는
Hello.
발제하시고 패널 참석하신 분들에게서 이제
So today we've heard some good presentations and panel comments, and thank you very much, Professor Park, for giving me the opportunity to share my comments with you.
말씀해 주신 것 중에서
So out of the many things that were mentioned, the fact that sports
하나의 이제
can be a good channel to connect the two Koreas, and that
행동으로 옮기신 우리 김경성
and we've been seeing Chairman Kim of the various examples where he actually implemented upon that vision, and I find that very trustworthy. But Dr. Seliger has mentioned that
남북 관계 제가
when it comes to the government, of course, I was a government official, but you can see that even sending a fax is controlled by the government. But in terms of the civilian cooperation, just like we saw in the case of Germany, it would be great if we can provide some more autonomy to the civilians and open up some more new opportunities. And I cannot agree more to that comment.
제가 이제 말씀드리고 싶은 건
And one point that I'd like to mention is that, well, today's topic is basically Gangwon 2024 Winter Youth Olympic Games and Inter-Korean Peace Promotion Measures. So I believe that in the future, the younger generation will be leading the process, whether it be the South or the North. You can see that we need to break away from this Cold War type of thinking. If you look at those that were born in the 80s and 90s, those in their teens, you can see that they're no longer tied to such type of propaganda or such a thought process. And I think that they will now take a new approach. And if you look at 2024, it's the Youth Olympic Games. The Youth Olympic Games is a great sports event, but it also has to do with bringing the youth, the future leaders, together to take part, to participate even more than ever before. And I hope that it does serve that purpose.
실제로
And in 2024, the Winter Youth Olympic Games, we do have Chairman Kim that is supporting the games. So if you can maybe give us some more information on how you're going to support the games, that'd be great. And also, Dr. Seliger, could you maybe give us some more advice in terms of some youth cooperation or exchange in Germany, in the two Germanys? Thank you.
준비하고 계시고
Yes, thank you. So I will be giving the speakers some more time to prepare their answers. And now let me now move on to another member in the audience.
어디
Yes.
예.
Yes, I did not see you there for a while.
Pakistan. My question is to Professor Bernhard. It's related to sports diplomacy. Actually, I'm from Pakistan. More than 220 million people are living in Pakistan, and more than 500 million people are living in India. But last decade, our sports diplomatic relations they are not good. So countries have banned the sports relations. So whenever I saw any cricket match or any other sports, people are really enjoying. So but the sports diplomacy banning, it's really putting the negative psychological effects directly on the public. So do you think UN should ban the diplomatic tools against the countries? Like some countries, either North Korea or South Korea, Russia, they are also using the sports diplomatic tools against geopolitical relations. Yes, thank you.
이거 좋으신 말씀입니다.
Yes, thank you very much for that good question. Yes, we have India and Pakistan, of course. And any more questions from the floor?
Hello, my name is Tony. I'm from Indonesia. I just want to comment. Now I'm studying major of sports management in Seoul National University. So the first time I know the unification process of North and South Korea is in sports. You know, in Asian Games 2018 is in Indonesia. So vast majority of Indonesian people knows the unification of South and North Korea is based on that moment. And so years after the tournament, after the Asian Games, our young people, kids and teenagers use the moment of that when we fight each other in sports, in grassroots level, we can say that North Korea and South Korea are peace in sports. Why we cannot do that in sports, in our sports? Because you know, in Indonesia we have 300 more tribes. So sometimes when we held local games, local tournaments, they fight each other. But based on the North and South Korea in one flag in Asian Games 2018 in Jakarta, we inspired by that. So it's not the question, but we hope Indonesian hope Korean Peninsula will have a bright future in peace. Thank you.
좋은 예를 지적하셨네요. 자카르타.
Thank you very much for that comment. Yes, in Jakarta. We'll like to hear from one more person from the floor.
My name is Oljas. I'm from Kazakhstan. I'm a group mate of Doni, also studying in Seoul National University. Thank you very much for great speeches. I really get a lot of new information for myself about the sports and relationships of North and South Korea. So I don't have a question. I have maybe a small suggestion. Actually, by what I hear, speakers mentioned about art that we've seen on opening ceremonies, that musical performance. Then it was mentioned sport, the main topic, and then it was mentioned the meeting in 2024, the religious leaders of the world also in Korea. So I'm just curious, is it possible also to bring another thing like history of sports? Because Mr. Kim said that there is already football matches was going on between North Korea and South Korea teams, and maybe to make some small documentary, adding up all the maybe some archery when North Korea and South Korea was unified. There may be in archives, in libraries, there is some pictures as people unified. It's like playing archery, some national sports, and also that football games, and making small documentary. Because as previous ex-vice minister said, the youth will be bringing things. So youth need to have some examples that last like maybe 100 years ago, everything was okay. So actually we can bring it back. So they will have some basement, some historical basement, the facts on which they can stand and build that good building. But they will need to have that strong basement, you know, based on history. And I'm sure that before, North Korea and South Korea had a lot of good moments in sports, and not only in sports. So maybe to make a small documentary about that moments, to put all that things together from archives, so the youngsters can see that it's not always been like this, that North Korea and South Korea been together before, and they had a wonderful moment, so they can be inspired by that pictures or maybe stories, and so they can live up with that and continue that legacy in future.
Thank you. 아마 김경성 이사장께서
Yes, Chairman Kim, I do know that he put together a video on the history of soccer between the two Koreas, so I think that's good to note. And in 2 years, it's the Youth Olympics. So I think that there were a lot of questions on that. So that was a very good question, so thank you for that. So first, Dr. Seliger, would you like to comment or respond to some of the questions? And then I would like to invite Chairman Kim, and then I will wrap up.
Well, first of all, I was certainly very happy, former Vice Minister, about what you said. And it's really not easy to give up this control by the state, but it's almost a burden for the state also nowadays. And I think it ties very well in with what our questioner said about the situation in Pakistan and India, though I don't know it. But if we have sports as narrowly understand sports diplomacy, it's always politics. So, and I think also the North Koreans, I see it in other fields better because I'm not a sportsman. Let's say in the field of water, South Korea founds an organization in Northeast Asia regarding water, and then they hope to lure in the North Koreans. They have an organization for forestry, and they lure in the North Koreans, but they are not stupid. So if you take it too narrowly, you go into a third country just to invite the North Koreans. Probably it wouldn't work. It can only work if it's really genuinely a civilian exchange, and I think that's what's also the problem, but I'm not so sure about the situation between Pakistan and India. It must be really coming from the civilian sector and not related to the government. And the only other thing I can add or impress once more is this question of online meetings, because it's not only about defectors. I mean, that wouldn't be good for North Koreans to talk about, but there are ongoing online seminars with North Koreans, and we do them, for example, in the field of forestry or environment, and others do it in other fields. And you could really relatively easily, there was a meeting on maritime issues recently where North Korea, even on the government level, participated. So you could really imagine and say, on the Olympic level, you invite different countries to an online meeting, and I'm sure the North Koreans would be very interested, because from everywhere, from the embassies of North Korea in European countries, from our partners in Pyongyang, we hear they are very eager to reconnect, not necessarily with South Koreans, but with the international community. They clearly, the last 3 years took a terrible toll on them, or the last 2 years. It was not very easy for them. And they want again to exchange. And online is not as good as offline, but it's the first start.
감사합니다. 마지막.
Thank you very much for their contribution. We'd now like to ask Mr. Kim Kyung-sun to give his comments. Thank you very much for your insightful comments. Particularly, I would like to thank Representative Mr. Seliger, Mr. Lee Yanggoo, and all of our comments from the floor. Thank you very much. Over the past 20 years or so, we have engaged in about 22 counts of sports exchange programs. 6 of them were in ROK, 8 in the DPRK, and the rest were held in a third nation. So if we could not host it in either of the two Koreas, we went to a third country. Because of the May 24 measures, when there was a factory once in North Korea, the factory had to be closed. This was relocated to China with the ROK capital and North Korean laborers, with Chinese land and facilities being used. So that was also an issue of an incident of trilateral cooperation, where Gangwon was invited
2024 청소년 올림픽 개최도
For the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympic Games, because we're the host, that we were invited to come to the Beijing Olympics, and because we pledge support to African countries, about 54 African countries, because we pledge support to provide support to them because they don't have natural snow.
지원 사업이
We were able to have sports diplomatic measures in full force in Beijing because we're a host country, plus we have these support measures in place.
시작되죠.
We know that the 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympic Games are going to be for the future generation, for the youth generation, and our support is going to begin in April. We're going to start providing contributions to African nations and etc.
그 원산을 갈 때
At the time, we proposed to the DPRK that when we are to travel to Wonsan, for example, and the African athletes go to Wonsan to train, we said that perhaps we should also have some South Korean children or South Korean youth go with them to Wonsan because they have this vague fear about North Korea. Earlier on, we had saw that interview with the Philharmonic performers, and they said that they were vaguely afraid of going to North Korea because they don't know. They didn't know anything about North Korea. It's the same with us. We think that North Korea is bad, and we have this vague fear of North Korea. How can we overcome this? I think that the 2024 support projects and sports diplomacy can allow us to overcome this fear.
그다음에 아까 저 인도네시아
This was something that our different speakers from Indonesia, Pakistan have all said that if we can engage in sports diplomacy,
저는 충분히
I think that if you can perhaps maybe later on be host nation to important games, that you can overcome these kinds of efforts. Thank you very much. We have heard very great comments from everyone.
왜,
We have, yes,
예.
Ambassador Lee.
그
I would just like to add a little bit.
또 성공을 위한다면은 지금 우리가
For success of the 2024 games, I think that
나야 될 것.
we have to rescue ourselves from two things.
하나고
The first is that we shouldn't necessarily tie all that we do to peace. And secondly, we shouldn't necessarily tie everything that we do with North Korea. We have to be able to think more broadly so that we can, in the end, achieve peace with North Korea. So we have to see this from the perspective of a more global perspective. So we shouldn't be burdened by our own worries and concerns a little bit too much. And secondly, we have to understand this is for the youth. So in 2024, the World Jamboree is going to be held in Seoul-gun. So over the next 3 years, we're going to work really hard. And I think that Korea is going to be center stage for different youth festivals. So you have to keep that in mind as we go into 2024. Thank you.
자, 이제 마무리하겠습니다.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me wrap up. Thank you so much for all of those insightful comments.
좋은 것 같습니다.
And I think we are lucky
4년에
because you can see that we have this event in 2024.
올림픽이
So the Winter Youth Olympics is to take place in 2 years. Why do I believe that this is an exciting news? It was briefly mentioned, but you can see that the political and the military conflicts between the two Koreas is so severe. We cannot find a way to solve this. We had the Korean War,
뒤로 뭐 최근에
and recently you can see that we were trying to go for the DPRK US summit, and we tried to find a way to push forward for the end of war declaration. I thought that they would be against it, but they also tried to support this. And North Korea could not take part in the Beijing Olympics. And you can see that there were a number of failures, but I do believe that failure is the mother of success. And all that remains is that card of success, because it was just a series of failures. But you can see that we do have these political issues. But then this event, it's a sporting event, and it's supposed to take place in Gangwon. It would be the Youth Olympics in 2024. So this is like basically the roadmap that was offered by IOC, and I think that this is going to be excellent news. So let me wrap up.
남북
The Winter Youth Olympics.
어떤 증진 방안을 내놓을 것인가?
How will it promote inter-Korean peace? So thank you very much for all of your insightful comments, and we hope that that does come true. Yes, thank you very much for all of your words. And as was mentioned, there are challenges that cannot be solved with politics, but the sports can definitely be a good channel for us to find that solution. And I think that we all do agree on this idea. And how are you going to utilize sports diplomacy? Well, through the comments by our presenters and our members of the audience has given us great food for thought. So it was a very productive, insightful session. Once again, I would like to extend my gratitude to all of our participants for contributing. And 2024 Gangwon Winter Youth Olympics, I truly hope that we do engage in a joint host with North Korea. And with that, let us close this session. Thank you very much. So this is the end of today's session. However, PyeongChang Peace Forum continues on tomorrow. So from 10 to 11:30, we will have the first session on peace and public diplomacy. So I would like to ask for your interest tomorrow as well. Thank you.